long before the walls of Troy burned, before a single ship sailed from Greece. A prophecy hung over an unborn child like a sword suspended by thread. Themis, the ancient goddess of divine law and justice, had spoken a warning that shook Olympus itself. The child would become the greatest warrior the world had ever known. But greatness, the fates decreed, would come at a price no mother could willingly pay. Thetis, a sea nymph of extraordinary beauty, had caught the attention of both Zeus and Poseidon. Yet Themis's prophecy warned that any son born to Thetis would surpass his father in glory and power. The gods, unwilling to risk their thrones, forced her into marriage with a mortal, Peleus, king of Phthia. The wedding itself became legend. All the gods attended except Eris, goddess of discord, who had been deliberately excluded from the celebration. In her fury at the insult, she crafted her revenge. She threw a golden apple inscribed, "To the fairest among the divine guests," igniting a bitter rivalry between Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. To settle the dispute, the goddesses would eventually turn to Paris, a prince of Troy, asking him to judge between them. Each offered bribes. Hera promised power, Athena offered wisdom and victory in war, and Aphrodite offered the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, who helped him claim Helen of Sparta as his prize, regardless of her marriage to Menelaus. That single act of spite from Eris set in motion the chain of events that would ignite the Trojan War. But on that wedding day, it was merely an omen. When Thetis bore her son, she looked upon him with a mother's love twisted by impossible knowledge. She knew his fate. She had seen it written in the patterns of foam upon the sea, heard it whispered in the voices of her sister nymphs. Her son would die young, cut down in his prime, his name echoing through eternity while his body turned to ash. Desperate to change what could not be changed, Thetis carried the infant Achilles to the river Styx, the black water that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. She gripped him by the heel and plunged him into those deathless waters, hoping to make him invulnerable. The magic worked, almost. Everywhere the water touched, his flesh became impenetrable, harder than any bronze shield, immune to any blade. But where her fingers held his heel, the water never reached. That small patch of mortal flesh remained, a weakness invisible to the eye, a door left open for fate to enter. Some accounts tell a different version of her desperation. In these tales, Thetis held her son over divine flames each night, burning away his mortality piece by piece. By day, she would anoint him with ambrosia, the sacred food of the gods that granted immortality to those who consumed it. By applying it to his skin, she hoped to make him divine, to transform his mortal flesh into something the fates could not touch. Peleus discovered her one evening and, horrified by what appeared to be the murder of his child, tore the boy from her grasp. The ritual remained incomplete. Thetis, heartbroken and furious, abandoned both husband and son, returning to the sea. Achilles grew in Phthia without his mother's constant presence, though she watched from afar, rising from the waves when he walked the shore, her warnings carried on the salt wind. Peleus, recognizing that his son needed more than a father's guidance, sent the boy to Mount Pelion, to the cave of Chiron. Chiron was unlike any other centaur, where his kind were known for drunkenness and savagery. Chiron possessed wisdom that rivaled the gods themselves. He had tutored heroes before, Jason, Asclepius, countless others who carved their names into history, but none would surpass Achilles. In Chiron's care, the boy learned the ways of war. He mastered the spear and sword, trained until his body moved with a speed that seemed impossible, a grace that made violence look like dance. Chiron taught him more than combat. He learned music, drawing sweet sounds from the lyre that seemed at odds with hands meant for killing. He studied healing arts, learned which herbs stopped bleeding and which brought sleep. He was taught ethics and honor, the code that separated a warrior from a butcher. Yet even Chiron could see what made Achilles different from every other student. The boy possessed something beyond skill or knowledge, a kind of furious excellence, an intensity that burned in everything he did. When he fought, even in practice, his eyes held a gleam that was almost inhuman. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to be remembered forever. During these years, another boy arrived at Chiron's cave. Patroclus was older, the son of Menoetius, sent to Pelion after killing another boy in a dispute over a game of dice. The death had been accidental, born of anger rather than malice, but exile was exile. Patroclus arrived ashamed, withdrawn, bearing the weight of what he'd done. Achilles and Patroclus became inseparable. The nature of their bond has been debated across centuries: brothers in arms, cousins, lovers, friends closer than blood. The exact nature matters less than its depth. They were two halves of a whole, Patroclus tempering Achilles' rage with gentleness, Achilles giving Patroclus purpose beyond his shame. Where Achilles was swift and terrible, Patroclus was steady and kind. Where Achilles dreamed of glory, Patroclus dreamed simply of standing beside him. As Achilles approached manhood, Thetis emerged from the sea with a warning. War was coming. Helen of Sparta had been taken to Troy. Whether by force or choice depended on who told the story. Her husband Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon were gathering every Greek king and warrior for a massive expedition to retrieve her and punish Troy. All men who had sworn an oath to protect Helen's marriage were being called to honor that vow. Thetis told her son of a prophecy she had received. If Achilles went to Troy, he would win glory beyond measure. His name would be spoken for thousands of years, his deeds immortalized in song and story. But he would never return home. He would die beneath Troy's walls, young and beautiful, cut down before his time. If he stayed in Phthia, he would live a long life. He would marry, have children, grow old surrounded by family. He would know peace and contentment. But when he died, his name would be forgotten within a generation, lost like so many others who chose safety over glory. The choice was his alone. For a time, Thetis attempted to make the choice for him. She brought Achilles to the island of Skyros and pleaded with him to hide among the daughters of King Lycurgus, disguised as one of them. Whether Achilles truly consented to this plan or simply yielded to his mother's desperation remains unclear in the old stories. What is certain is that he wore women's clothing and lived among the princesses, his identity known only to Thetis and possibly to one of Lycurgus' daughters, Deidamia. Deidamia either discovered his true nature or was let in on the secret. A relationship developed between them, and she became pregnant with his child. The pregnancy and birth were kept hidden from King Lycurgus, who remained unaware that one of his daughter's companions was actually a young man, and that his daughter now carried that man's son. The child would later be named Neoptolemus, though his story belonged to a darker time. But Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, had heard prophecies of his own. Troy could not fall without Achilles. He came to Skyros disguised as a merchant, bearing gifts, jewelry, fine cloth, cosmetics for the women. Hidden among these feminine treasures, he placed a spear and shield. When presented with the gifts, the daughters of Lycurgus crowded around the jewelry and fabric. But Achilles reached immediately for the weapons, his hands knowing their weight and balance before his mind registered the trap. Odysseus smiled. The disguise fell away like mist under sun. King Lycurgus learned the truth in that moment, that the young woman he had harbored was Greece's greatest warrior, and that his daughter had borne this warrior's son. Achilles made his choice: glory and an early grave over obscurity and old age. Perhaps it was never really a choice at all. His nature pulled him toward war the way rivers flow toward the sea. He agreed to sail for Troy. Thetis, seeing her son's fate sealed, turned her grief into action. She commissioned the god Hephaestus himself to forge armor worthy of the greatest warrior who would ever live. The smith god crafted a shield decorated with scenes of the entire world: cities at peace and cities at war, farmers harvesting grain, dancers at festivals, the ocean encircling everything. He made a breastplate that shone like captured stars, a helmet crested with gold, and greaves that fitted Achilles' legs as if grown from his own skin. She also gave him 2 immortal horses, Xanthos and Balios, born of the wind itself. They could run faster than any mortal steed, tireless and intelligent, understanding human speech though they rarely chose to use their own voices. Thus armed and mounted, Achilles gathered his Myrmidons, the legendary warriors of Phthia, men who followed him with absolute loyalty, and sailed for Aulis, where the Greek fleet was assembling. Patroclus came with him, refusing to be left behind. At Aulis, the winds died. The massive fleet sat motionless, hundreds of ships going nowhere, thousands of warriors growing restless. The seer Calchas declared that Artemis, the Greek goddess of the hunt, wilderness, wild animals, childbirth, and chastity, demanded a sacrifice. Agamemnon must offer his own daughter, Iphigenia, to appease the goddess's anger. The exact nature of Agamemnon's offense against Artemis varies by account. Some say he killed one of her sacred deer and boasted of it. Others claim he had promised the goddess his most beautiful possession years earlier and never paid the debt. Regardless, the price was now due. Agamemnon sent word to his wife Clytemnestra that Iphigenia was to come to Aulis to marry Achilles. This was a lie, a lure to bring the girl within reach. When the truth emerged, Achilles was furious that his name had been used in such deception. He offered to defend Iphigenia, to stand against the entire Greek army if necessary. But Iphigenia, in some versions, chose to accept her fate for the glory of Greece. She walked to the altar willingly. Whether she died there or was spirited away by Artemis at the last moment, replaced by a deer, accounts differ. But the winds returned. The fleet sailed for Troy. Yet the Greeks did not reach Troy on their first attempt. They made landfall in Mysia, mistaking it for Trojan territory. Achilles led the assault against what he believed were Trojan forces. The Mysians, led by their king Telephus, himself a son of Heracles, fought desperately to defend their homeland. In the battle, Achilles wounded Telephus with his spear, driving the Mysians back. Only after the fighting did the Greeks realize their error. They had attacked the wrong kingdom entirely. They withdrew and attempted to sail again for Troy, but storms scattered the fleet. The ships were driven back to Greece, forcing them to regroup. Meanwhile, Telephus's wound refused to heal, festering and causing him agony. An oracle told him that only the weapon that caused the wound could cure it. Telephus traveled to Greece in disguise, eventually revealing himself and begging Achilles for help. Achilles, whether out of guilt or pragmatism, agreed. He scraped rust from his spear onto the wound, and miraculously, it healed. In return, Telephus guided the Greeks on the correct route to Troy. The war had been delayed by years because of a single navigational error. The war did not begin immediately upon arrival. First came smaller conflicts, battles against Troy's allies up and down the coast. For 9 years, the Greeks raided cities, gathered supplies, wore down Troy's support. Achilles led many of these campaigns, his reputation growing with each victory. He sacked the city Lyrnessus and took a woman named Briseis as his prize. She was a priestess, a widow whose husband and brothers Achilles himself had slain. Yet something developed between them, perhaps affection, possibly even love, though love born from violence and captivity can never be entirely free of its origins. Meanwhile, Agamemnon had raided the city of Chrysae and taken Chryseis, the daughter of Chrysis, a priest of Apollo, as his own war prize. When her father came begging for her return, offering ransom, Agamemnon refused with contempt. The priest prayed to Apollo, and the god sent a plague that ravaged the Greek camp, bodies piling up like cordwood, funeral pyres burning day and night. Calchas the seer declared that the plague would only end when Chryseis was returned. Agamemnon, furious at losing his prize, agreed, but only if he received compensation. His eyes fell on Briseis. If he must give up his war prize, then Achilles must give up his. Achilles could have killed Agamemnon then. His hand went to his sword, rage flooding through him like liquid fire. But Athena appeared, visible only to him, and stayed his hand. She promised that greater honor would come from restraint. Achilles listened, barely. He released Briseis to Agamemnon's heralds, but swore a mighty oath. He would fight no more for the Greeks. Let them face Troy without him. Let them die without his spear to protect them. He withdrew to his tent with Patroclus and the Myrmidons, and without Achilles the Greeks began to lose. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and eldest son of King Priam, led the Trojans in a devastating counterattack. The Greeks were driven back from Troy's walls, pushed across the plain, forced to fight among their own ships. Desperate, Agamemnon sent ambassadors to Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor. They offered treasures beyond counting, cities to rule. Briseis returned untouched, even Agamemnon's own daughter in marriage. Achilles refused it all. His honor had been stripped before the entire army. No amount of gold could repair what had been broken. He told them he was considering sailing home, abandoning the war entirely. He spoke of the prophecy, of the choice between a long life and a glorious death. Perhaps, he suggested, he had chosen wrong. But he didn't leave. Something kept him anchored to the beach at Troy. Pride, perhaps, or fate's invisible chains. Or maybe he knew, in his heart, that his story wasn't finished. The Trojans pressed harder. They broke through the Greek fortifications, fought their way to the ships themselves, hurling torches onto the black-tarred hulls. One more day and the entire fleet would burn. The Greeks would be stranded, helpless, doomed. Patroclus couldn't bear it. He came to Achilles and begged. If Achilles wouldn't fight, then let Patroclus wear his armor. Let the Trojans see what they thought was Achilles returning to battle. The sight alone might drive them back, give the Greeks room to breathe, time to recover. Achilles agreed but gave strict instructions. Patroclus was to drive the Trojans from the ships and then return. Nothing more. He was not to pursue them across the plain. He was not to approach the walls. He was to win breathing room and come back. Patroclus put on the divine armor. He took Achilles' spear, mounted one of the immortal horses, and led the Myrmidons into battle. The effect was immediate. The Trojans saw the armor, saw the Myrmidons, and terror seized them. They fled, convinced that Achilles had returned to the fight. Patroclus pursued. He forgot the instructions or couldn't help himself, caught in battle's exhilaration. He drove the Trojans all the way back across the plain. He defeated Sarpedon, son of Zeus, a hero of legendary prowess. He reached the walls of Troy itself. 3 times he attempted to scale those walls, and 3 times Apollo himself threw him back. On the 4th attempt, the god spoke, his voice like thunder. "Fall back, Patroclus. Troy is not fated to fall to your spear, nor even to Achilles, who is far greater than you." Patroclus retreated, but the damage was done. He had gone too far. Hector saw him, recognized through combat that this was not Achilles. The movements were skilled but different, the fury present but lacking that inhuman edge. Apollo aided Hector, striking Patroclus from behind, stunning him, sending his helmet rolling in the dust. The spear that had never failed Achilles shattered. The divine armor loosened. Euphorbus struck first, a spear thrust between the shoulder blades. Patroclus fell to his knees, but it was Hector who delivered the final blow, his spear finding its mark through Patroclus's body. As Patroclus died, he spoke a final prophecy. "You yourself will not live long. Death and fate stand beside you, brought by Achilles, son of Peleus." Hector stripped the divine armor from Patroclus's corpse and put it on himself, claiming it as his prize. A fierce battle erupted over the body itself, Greeks and Trojans fighting savagely for possession of the fallen warrior. Word reached Achilles. The sound that came from his throat was not quite human. Part roar, part wail, grief and rage twisted into something primal. His mother heard it beneath the waves and rose to find her son covered in dust and ashes, tearing at his hair, wishing for death. Thetis told him that his own death would follow soon after Hector's. Achilles didn't care. Patroclus was dead, sent to fight in his place while wearing his armor. Nothing else mattered. Hector would pay the price. Troy itself would burn. But he had no armor. Hector wore it now. Thetis promised to return to Hephaestus, to commission new armor even more magnificent than the first. Until then, Achilles must wait. He couldn't wait. He walked to the edge of the Greek fortifications unarmed. Athena wrapped him in a golden cloud and placed a flame around his head. He opened his mouth and screamed, a battle cry so terrible that Trojan horses panicked and men fell back in terror. 3 times he shouted, and 3 times the Trojans recoiled. The Trojans retreated. The Greeks recovered Patroclus's body. That night, Achilles held his friend's corpse and wept, refusing to release him until Thetis returned with the new armor. When dawn came, she brought weapons crafted by a god, a shield even more magnificent than the first, depicting the cosmos in intricate detail, armor that shone like the sun itself, a sword that had never known defeat. Wearing this, Achilles looked like a god walking among men. He reconciled with Agamemnon, though the words were hollow, meaningless. Briseis was returned. Gifts were given. Achilles accepted it all with indifference. He wanted only one thing now: Hector's life. He entered battle like a force of nature. Warriors fell before him. The Trojans fled in total panic, trampling each other to reach the city gates. The river Scamander became so choked with the fallen that the river god himself rose up in protest, trying to drown Achilles beneath a flood. Hephaestus sent fire to drive the water back, God battling God while Achilles waded through the carnage. He met Aeneas in combat, the Trojan hero who would one day found Rome, though that future remained unwritten. Poseidon himself intervened to save Aeneas, recognizing that he carried a different destiny, one that required survival. Achilles pressed forward through every warrior who stood before him. Finally, only Hector remained outside Troy's walls. The rest of the Trojans had fled inside, but Hector stood alone before the Scaean gate. His father, King Priam, begged him from the walls to come inside. His mother, Hecuba, tore her robes in anguish, pleading. But Hector had led this war. He had struck down Patroclus. Honor demanded he face what was coming. Then he saw Achilles approaching, armor blazing in the sun, and fear seized him. Hector ran. The greatest warrior of Troy fled, and Achilles pursued. 3 times they circled the walls of Troy, Hector running for his life, Achilles tireless in pursuit. Zeus weighed their fates in golden scales. Hector's sank toward death. Apollo, who had protected Hector until now, withdrew. Athena appeared to Hector disguised as his brother Deiphobus, promising to stand with him against Achilles. Believing he had support, Hector stopped running and turned to fight. The combat was brief. Hector hurled his spear at Achilles, but it struck the divine shield and bounced harmlessly away. He turned to ask Deiphobus for another spear, but his brother was gone, had never been there at all. Hector understood then that the gods had abandoned him, that he was going to die. He drew his sword and charged, choosing to die like a warrior rather than a coward. Achilles studied him, noting every gap in the armor. His armor, the armor Hector had stripped from Patroclus. There, at the throat, where the collarbones met. Achilles drove his spear into that exact spot. Hector fell, the bronze point through his throat, though it missed his windpipe. He could still speak. He begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. Achilles refused. He told the dying man that he would feed his corpse to dogs and birds, that he would desecrate it in ways that would deny him rest and peace. Hector's final words were another prophecy. Paris and Apollo will end you at the Scaean gate. Achilles stripped the body and did something that shocked even battle-hardened warriors. He pierced Hector's heels, threaded leather straps through the tendons, and tied the corpse to his chariot. Then he dragged it around Troy's walls, around Patroclus's funeral pyre, day after day, defiling the body of Troy's hero while his family watched in helpless horror from the walls. For 11 days, Achilles held funeral games for Patroclus, the corpse of Hector still tied to his chariot, still being dragged through the dust. The games featured contests of strength and skill, prizes distributed, honors given, all the proper rituals. But Achilles' grief remained absolute, a wound that wouldn't close. On the 12th night, an old man appeared in Achilles' tent. It was King Priam himself, Troy's king, who had somehow passed through the entire Greek camp unseen. He came alone, unarmed, and threw himself at Achilles' feet. He kissed the hands that had killed his sons, Hector and so many others, and begged for Hector's body. He offered ransom beyond measure. But more than that, he offered something else. One father's grief meeting another's, one human being asking another to remember what it meant to be human. Achilles wept. He thought of his own father Peleus, who he would never see again, who would receive word of his son's death and know the same grief that now consumed Priam. He thought of Patroclus, of loss, of the futility of rage that could never bring back the dead. He granted Priam's request. He returned Hector's body and agreed to a truce for the funeral. He even helped wash and prepare the corpse himself, covering the worst desecrations so that Priam wouldn't have to see exactly what had been done. Priam returned to Troy with his son's body. The city mourned for 9 days, then built a great pyre and burned Hector with all honors. Andromache, his widow, wept over his bones. Helen, for whom this war was being fought, grieved the loss of the one Trojan who had always treated her with kindness. Hecuba mourned a son, one of many she would lose. But Achilles' fate was approaching. Shortly after Hector's death, he encountered Penthesilea, an Amazon queen who had come to aid Troy. They fought, and Achilles prevailed. But as he removed her helmet and saw her face, he fell in love with her beauty even as she died. The Greeks mocked him for it. One warrior, Thersites, laughed and made crude jokes about Achilles desiring corpses. Achilles struck him down with a single blow, causing dissent among the Greeks. Memnon, king of Ethiopia and a son of the goddess Eos, arrived with fresh troops to aid Troy. He was a warrior of Achilles' caliber, wearing armor also crafted by Hephaestus. They met in single combat while the gods watched. Zeus weighed their fates, and Memnon sank toward death. Achilles struck the fatal blow. Eos begged Zeus to grant her son some form of immortality, and he was transformed into a constellation or granted eternal life in some accounts. Details vary, but he was honored in death. Then came the day that Hector had prophesied. Achilles led an assault on Troy's gates, fighting with the same furious intensity that had defined him since Patroclus' death. He had nearly broken through the Scaean gate itself. Paris, the prince whose theft or love of Helen had started this entire war, stood on the walls. He was not a warrior of Hector's caliber, not even close. But Apollo guided his arrow, a god's hand steadying mortal aim, the same god whose son Achilles had slain years before on Tenedos. The arrow flew and struck Achilles in the heel, the only place his body could be wounded, where his mother's fingers had held him in the river Styx decades earlier. Achilles fell. The Greeks fought desperately to recover his body. Ajax carried the corpse while Odysseus held back the Trojans. They brought him back to camp, where Thetis emerged from the sea one final time to mourn her son. The funeral lasted 17 days. His ashes were mixed with those of Patroclus and placed in a golden urn. The Myrmidons cut their hair in mourning. Games were held in his honor, greater than any before. Thetis offered his divine armor as a prize for the Greek warrior who had contributed most to the war effort. The armor was awarded to Odysseus. Ajax, who had carried Achilles' corpse from the battlefield, felt he deserved it more. The perceived injustice drove him mad. Whether by his own rage or Athena's influence varies by account. In his madness, he attacked what he believed to be Greek commanders. When sanity returned and he realized what he'd done, he fell on his sword. But Achilles' story had one final chapter. The Greeks learned of a prophecy. Troy could not fall without Achilles' son joining the war. Odysseus traveled to Skyros and found Neoptolemus, now grown, the child fathered during Achilles' time in disguise. Neoptolemus came to Troy, was given his father's armor, and proved himself to be Achilles' son in both skill and savagery. He was among those who entered Troy inside the wooden horse. He personally took King Priam's life at an altar. He threw Hector's infant son from the walls to prevent any heir from claiming Troy's throne. The cruelty his father had shown to Hector's corpse lived on in Neoptolemus's treatment of Hector's family. Troy fell. The city burned. Every prophecy was fulfilled. Achilles had made his choice years earlier on the beach at Phia, glory and an early death over a long life in obscurity. He received exactly what the fates promised. His name echoed through the centuries, spoken in every language, remembered when the names of gentler, longer-lived men faded into nothing. But in the underworld, when Odysseus visited during his wanderings and praised Achilles' eternal glory, the shade of Achilles gave a response that haunts every telling. I would rather be a living slave to a poor man than rule over all the dead. Perhaps in death he had finally understood the true cost of the choice he made. Perhaps he saw what Patroclus' companionship had meant more clearly than he had in life. Or perhaps even the greatest warrior who ever lived learned too late that glory, however eternal, is cold comfort in the dark.